have done an amazing job on early screening for autism, opposing the task force of the Pediatric Society, presenting the evidence on the topic. How do you see the current consensus on this topic today?
Well, as far as I understand it, the task force has not yet changed their recommendation for early screening in autism. And, the reasoning is because their perspective is that studies that have shown that treatment for autism is effective, there have been lots of studies that have shown this is effective, they're saying that they can't connect early screening with treatment success because a lot of the kids that participate in the treatment studies might have just been referred from a clinic, or maybe they got screened, but we don't know because it wasn't presented in the paper. And so I don't think that the task force is opposed to screening. They're just sort of neutral in their recommendation, and they're waiting for papers to come out that are directly linking early screening, early treatment engagement to better outcomes. And we're actually starting to try to do some of that work, but the pandemic really messed it up, obviously, because a lot of our kids, we were doing this really big study where we're tracking children that got early treatment, early screening and early treatment and their long-term outcomes. But then, for the past 2.5 years, treatment has been really negatively impacted by COVID. Obviously, people weren't getting treatment and everybody's in their house and what have you. So to kind of circle back, I think that there are multiple ways, though, that we can kind of start to improve screening. One is to address the task force concern by linking, connecting the dots between early screening and better outcomes. And the other is, I think that we should also be developing better screening, because if you look at uptake of pediatricians doing screening, for example, here in the United States, we have what are called well baby checkups, where, a mother will come in to have her child receive a well baby checkup at various ages, like 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, right? It's very standard at regular ages. Do you have that? Is it the same in Brazil?
Yes.
So, kind of like it's very standard. If you have healthcare, and most people in America do have healthcare, they're going and they're getting this. But the way it works now is parents will just fill out a screening tool like the MCHAT, which was a lot about what the task force was reporting on. And one of the things we're doing in our center is we're trying to create sort of objective biomarkers of autism that are a little bit, I would say that they don't really rely on parents' subjective opinion of their child's behaviors. We're using eye tracking to provide quantitative metrics of a child's social and auditory visual attention patterns that are greatly associated with autism diagnosis. So we're kind of addressing your question in two ways. One is we are tracking the outcomes of kids who received early screening and treatment. And the second is we're just trying to change the way early screening occurs so that it's faster, not subjective, and objective and really accurate. So this way we're thinking that when a baby shows that they are not at expected milestones on eye tracking, a doctor will take that extremely seriously. Whereas right now, if a baby fails the MCHAT or they fail the CSPS or any of these other parent report forms, sometimes the doctors will refer for an evaluation and sometimes they don't. If you look at the research studies, usually only around a third of babies that fail one of these screening tools, like 33 to 40%, actually get referred for a developmental evaluation. So we've done some research to suggest that pediatricians, they're using their clinical judgment in combination with this screen, which is what they should do. But I think that if they received a quantitative and objective metric, like from eye tracking, then this might encourage more referrals for a diagnostic evaluation. And one day I think maybe we can even use eye tracking to diagnose.
Yes. Your work on eye tracking is very robust. There has now been a very important publication in Nature that I read recently.
Are you talking about the Nature Human Behavior paper that combined brain imaging with eye tracking? Because the most recent eye tracking paper that just came out
is the most recent.
The most recent one that you contacted me about was actually in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association.
I didn't read. I didn't read. Do you believe that there should be eye tracking as a universal screening tool for autism these days? That there is basis for that?
That's actually an excellent question. So there are, when people talk about screening, there is a level 1 screening, and that's universal screening, like you just talked about. So every baby that goes to their doctor for a well baby checkup would get screened. And then there's what's called a level 2 screener, where let's say a mother fills out the CSBS or the MCHAT and the baby fails that. Then they would go, let's say, and get eye tracking as the second type of screen. And what we're trying to figure out now is we know that actually children who already have some concern and who come here to our center who get eye tracked, the probability of them getting an autism diagnosis if they fail one or more of our eye tracking tests is very high, 85 to 95%. So the answer to your question is we are currently we're starting to investigate whether or not eye tracking is better as a level 1 screener, a level 2 screener, or straight out just a diagnostic tool. Like a mother just has a concern and she can go and get a diagnosis using eye tracking. So there's lots of different ways that it can be used, and it's relatively new technology. So we have not made a definitive sort of claim about which one is best, because we're still kind of comparing and contrasting all of the different ways that eye tracking can be used. Does that make sense? So yeah.
The recently systematic review about eye tracking, maybe 1 or 2 years ago, it was saying that was a difficulty because there was a multiple paradigms in the research. There is essentially your paradigm, and we have 2 different images, one pattern of the geometric image and a social stimuli. But there is the other line, there is the paradigm, and there is one people, and there is social areas and no social areas. That Amit Klein is a Brazilian researcher. He researches with this paradigm, and they made 2 studies recently that approves a new device. It's Early Point. The FDA approves that yes. device. They will sell that maybe June when the papers will publish. What's the difference in the meaning of these different paradigms for you?
Yeah, so if I understand what you're saying correctly, my paradigms use a preferential looking approach where you can look at geometric shapes or you look at the social images, right? And it's the percentage of time that the child is looking at, let's say, the geometric shapes that tells you whether or not they are at risk for an autism diagnosis. Dr. Klein's research has more what we call areas of interest. So you might draw around the eyes or the mouth and look at relationships between looking at different parts of a video. Whereas mine is a little bit simpler because it's really just, are you looking at geometric shapes or non-social images versus social images? And since his new papers haven't come out yet, I've only seen his published work. I can't speak to, because I haven't read his new papers yet because they're not out yet, or his, FDA-approved investigational device. But once I do, I can, give you a more informed response. So I can't really say. The only thing I can say is that ours has pretty simple, straightforward metrics. I have around 6 different eye tracking tests that we're working on, and Ami's has more, kind of more details about different areas of interest and relationships and fixation between different areas of interest. So it's, slightly different.
I participated with some judges and the group of judges, I don't know how to say, and Brazil with academic works with more simpler forms to do the eye tracking with cell phone or simple devices, because with your paradigm it's more simpler than if someone look to one or other side. It's more simpler, and maybe there is a research line to do that without more sophisticated equipment, because in third world it's very important. You have cheaper methods.
Scalability and accessibility are completely important. I completely agree. The only thing, though, right now we're trying to develop more of a medical grade system that would be used in the hands of medical professionals as our first phase. What I worry about right now, and maybe this could be different in the future, but like, let's say a mother gets the app, some eye tracking app, right? And she just holds the phone up to her baby's face. There are a lot of distractors in the environment. A dog could be barking in the home. Like, who knows, right? It's not very controlled. And within the natural world, you might get an incorrect answer, right? And so I want, at least our first phase, I want the eye tracking test that we develop to be extremely accurate and reliable. If a baby fails one of our eye tracking tests, we want to be very confident that they really do meet criteria for an autism diagnosis. If you're just looking at it on a phone, you don't know. Also, the screen is smaller. I mean, with an eye tracking device, you have infrared light beams that are coming out from the eye tracking machine and are bouncing back, that are reflected off the baby's cornea and is bouncing back into the eye tracking machine, and that's how you figure out the point of gaze. And it's extremely precise. There's very high accuracy with that. And I can't speak to, many years ago I did actually try with an iPad, and I used like head turns, but I wasn't satisfied with the accuracy of the results, to be honest. And that's why I sort of stopped doing that line of work at that time. Now, that being said, once we move forward with our kind of medical grade sort of eye tracking system that we're hoping to develop, I certainly can consider readdressing this idea of using your phone or something that anybody could just use. But right now, we're still really investigating the power of eye tracking and what it can do. And I really want it to be completely accurate. And I don't like it, errors. So I'm going to be doing it this way first. But I know other people are doing it in the phones and whatever. And I just worry about the potential for error.
Yes. When you move forward, you have to look for Brazil. We participate that research. That's really important for us. And we are several students, researchers, researching that. That will be very good. I have another question. You have very important research that demonstrates that it's possible to make a diagnosis of autism in a stable way in 14 months.
Yes.
Do you believe that we will be able to lower this number over time, or will we need other forms of diagnosis?
That's a great question. And you're probably referring to a paper that we had come out in JAMA Pediatrics in 2019. And yes, the diagnosis of autism is very stable by 14 months. I do believe that we probably can diagnose autism younger than that, because there's a lot of evidence to suggest that autism begins in the womb. It begins during pregnancy. And the fact that we're really not being able to find it until 12 months, sometimes a little earlier, really has more to do with the technologies and approaches that we're using to figure it out. Not that it's not there, although clearly the signs do become more visible and stronger as the child gets older. But I do think it will be possible. The reason, though, that I don't push for it right now is because what I really like about the system we do here in our center is that a baby comes to us as young as 12 months. And then if they meet diagnostic criteria for autism, we refer them for treatment the very same day that they come to our center. And there are best practices and there are validated treatments for autism as young as 12 months. I don't want to tell a mom of a 6-month-old that their child is meeting criteria for autism, but there's no validated treatments for a 6-month-old. And so there has to be a relationship between when you're able to give a diagnosis and when there are really good treatments ready to go. And I know that there are some people who are trying to do some research at slightly younger ages. And I think once we have great treatments, the diagnosis can go hand in hand. But for me, the most important thing is being able to offer something that's going to work and is going to be helpful at younger ages.
How is live in the border of the applied behavior that you told to us that you used to do, and the basic science on autism?
So I'm not sure I understand your question. So what you're saying is, I did start the first 10 years of my career as an applied behavior analysis researcher and treatment provider. I did my research on pivotal response training. I worked with Ted Gahar doing functional communication training. I've done a lot of behaviorally based treatment research. I did that for around 10 years. And then I really was hoping to try to figure out a way that I could help lots of kids at once. I felt like doing treatment was very labor intensive. It was very emotional, and it was great. Our treatments were very effective, but for a small number of kids at once. I wanted to do things that could help thousands, millions of kids. And so that's why I respecialized and took classes with the medical students and took classes with neurosciences students to learn about brain imaging, to get more training in statistics and kind of more large-scale studies for basic science research, because I wanted to try to bridge the gap between clinical research and basic science research. And that may not be answering your question because I'm not really clear what your question is exactly, but that was my motivation for doing it.
Yes, that's what
Okay.
I was
Okay.
asking
Okay.
about.
Okay. Good.
That's about what you said. You was a unicorn.
Yes. The fact, yes, that I've had like probably more like 12 or 13 years of clinical research and treatment training, and then I switched into basic science. Yes, it's kind of like being a unicorn because there really aren't that many of us. Some people will specialize in treatment and they're doing that their whole lives. Other people will specialize in basic science, but there aren't as many people that do the crossover.
When you look for the research about autism in the world, especially in the US, what's the lines in the basic science that was more promising in your view? In the genetics and the brain imaging, what's the more promising field of the research these days?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that any one field is more promising than another. They all bring something different to our understanding of autism, and they very often can be complementary. There's so much interesting stuff going on out there right now, like about the microbiome, trying to, up until whatever, maybe a decade ago, people really weren't even thinking about the role of bacteria and how that, there's a gut-brain axis and how those bacteria are impacting different aspects of our neural functioning. And so I think that's a huge and important area for research in autism that's been relatively unexplored, although people are starting to do it. We actually have, right now, when a parent comes in for our studies, and if their baby poops in their diaper when they're here, we ask if we can take some. And so we've been storing some fecal samples for starting this area of research. I think that's really interesting. Obviously, autism is a genetic disorder. The heritability is extremely high, and when you have two twins, monozygotic twins, identical twins, the concordance rates of both of them meeting the diagnosis of autism is like 85 to 90%. It's very high. So when you have monozygotic twins, even if they aren't living in the same house, even monozygotic twins that are reared apart, when they both meet the criteria, then that gives you a really big clue that autism is a highly genetic disorder. So understanding the genetic background of autism is really important, and it's challenging though because there are a lot of studies that will report on a single gene like PTEN or SHANK1 or whatever these genes, but then they only count for 1% or a half of a percent of kids with autism may have this issue, this genetic difference. And so right now we haven't found the genetic causes for autism really. We've made some advances, but it's confusing and complicated at times because they're also, if you look at typically developing individuals who do not have autism, we all have mutations too. You have them, I have them, you have them. And so, trying to unravel all of this and understand it is challenging. So I think what's going to end up happening is that there's lots of genes. So autism is polygenic. So even though somebody might have a PTEN or SHANK3 or whatever, it's not enough. We need to understand their background genetics, and maybe there's other genes involved. So we're just now beginning. But I think understanding the genetics is certainly exciting and important, but I think it's still kind of in its infancy. I love brain imaging. I think that's really exciting and interesting line of research that we do here at our center. So when a baby comes in for their evaluation here, we ask if they'd like to take a blood sample for our genetic studies. We do eye tracking, and we also ask if the families want to participate in brain imaging so we can really understand what brain pathways are developing well and which ones are not developing particularly well in children with autism, in the hopes that maybe one day when I start going back into treatment, we can check to see how the brain is changing in response to treatment and maybe ways that we can enhance and optimize treatment so that we can accelerate brain development in kids with autism. So that's been really interesting research. And so that paper that you talked about earlier, the Nature Human Behavior paper, actually looked at eye tracking and brain imaging and found that we do brain imaging during natural sleep, right? Because you can't get a toddler to hold still. I mean, I don't know if you've ever gotten an MRI scan, but you have to hold very still, otherwise there's motion artifact. So for us, we just do it during natural sleep. This way we don't have to worry about any babies holding still. We just tell the mom, okay, don't let your baby have a nap today. Make sure they're really tired, and we bring them down to the scanner. We just, put them down on the scanner bed, and then we put little headphones on them, and we pipe in lullabies or mother talking or different stories, and we record their brain activation. And we're finding that the children with autism, even though they're sleeping, that show attenuated or show reduced brain activation are also the ones that are showing more aberrant patterns with their eye tracking behavior. And so because of that, we're really starting to get the idea that children who are not looking at the right place at the right time during the first few years of life, their brains are not getting the right kind of environmental input to develop those pathways for social and language behaviors. And it's clear, you can see it on a brain scan. So we're trying to put together the pieces, and then of course the most obvious question is, okay, so what are you going to do about it, right? It's not that surprising that the children with autism who have really poor eye tracking scores also don't show a lot of brain activation in language areas. But now that we've got this really interesting information, how are we going to develop better treatments to see if we can't correct course and get the children to be able to achieve more of these developmental milestones that we hope that they're going to be able to achieve?
We published one systematic review in scientific reports maybe last year about fMRI in the wrestling. Estado de repouso, como é que é? I don't know. In the without movement with children and adolescents and adults with autism. Without movement is sedated. No?
Oh, okay,
yes. fMRI with sedation.
But fMRI with sedation is really complicated
Yes.
to try to figure out, because the sedation is obviously going to impact the neurofunctional circuits.
Yes.
And so it's hard to interpret the data if somebody's been sedated. You can look at the structural data, but functional data is really hard if somebody's been sedated.
Yes, we was the systematic review revealed some algorithms to trying to interpret this data, but it's very different. It's very difficult to have functional data. It's a challenge.
And then there's lots of, the other issue with brain imaging is that there's a lot of motion artifacts. So even though you might, provide somebody with some coaching and training and teach them, okay, hold really still, it's really hard for somebody on the spectrum because it's noisy in the scanner, it's unfamiliar, it's very hard. Yeah, it's very hard to hold still. So that's the good thing about doing sleep imaging with babies because they're all asleep. And a lot of kids don't move while they're sleeping. And we take measurements to see if there's any sudden movements, but they're pretty still when they're sleeping. And so we don't have a big problem with any motion confounds or artifacts in our data set, which is nice, because I used to do brain imaging with children with autism between the ages of 6 and 12. I did some studies looking at how well they're processing faces, and found some really cool stuff that when you show them strangers' faces, you have reduced activation in the fusiform gyrus area. But when you show them a picture of their mother's face, it lights up and they have great activation. So, it's really cool. It's really about attention for kids with autism, not that their brains don't have the connectivity to process a lot of this information. Sometimes it's their attentional gain. But I digress. But we had a lot of motion issues working with 6 to 12-year-olds that I don't have now working with the toddlers.
What are you working these days?
Well, we are definitely doing a lot of eye tracking. We are trying to innovate some new paradigms beyond the ones that I have published. I have several more that we will be publishing, hopefully, within this year, looking at different domains. So my eye tracking research is like the GeoPref tests or the complex social tests. Those two are very social visual, and there's no sound in those. It's really like, what does the baby like to look at? And then the Motherese eye tracking test that we just published in JAMA Network Open is auditory. So what do they like to listen to? We use gaze contingent technology, so where the baby looks triggers the sound file that comes up. And so that's a really fun and interesting way to use eye tracking to measure response or interest in sounds, right? In the past, most people use eye tracking to be like, oh, where are they looking? But for this, we have one video on one side of the eye tracking machine that shows a mother speaking in what I call motherese, that sing-songy voice, like, oh, sweetie, I love you, you're so wonderful. When you talk to a baby, your voice goes up and down. and you're really positive and animated. And so in our eye tracking task, our Mother Ease task, a baby can choose to look at the side of the video that shows the mother, and if they look there, the mother is speaking to them in this sing-songy, happy voice. But if they look on some other place in the video, they might see cars driving down a highway, beeping their horns, like beep, beep. And so we are using eye tracking to understand the difference between visual attention and auditory attention, and how, if a baby fails one test, are they going to fail this other type? But we're finding that there actually are some kids who do poorly on both, but there are some kids who are who have more challenges with the visual domain, other kids more with the auditory domain. And so we are using gaze contingent eye tracking to try to develop some new paradigms as well. And we're also using it to understand pupillometry response. So like the autonomic nervous system, when you get excited, your pupils dilate. And so there are certain things that are going to have the child be like excited, and certain things that maybe he's less excited about. So we're playing around with like new ways to try to use eye tracking.
My last question, I promise.
Yeah.
Simon Baron-Cohen uses your work, your eye tracking work, to one of our references to formulate the extremely brain theory about autism. That's how I knew you.
Oh, that's
your
great.
Work.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
He's so nice.
Yes. What do you think
guy.
about his
extreme
theory?
male brain theory?
Yes.
You know, I really focus a lot. I am extremely focused on early periods of life, the first few years. And so the extreme, male brain theory of autism really, I think, is a result of experience and exposure across many years. And so I haven't really done a lot of research or thought really into the extreme male brain theory, because it's really something that has a lot of explanatory power at older ages, right? It's really not something that I can bring to bear on a 1-year-old. And so I think at face value, it's extreme, it's a really interesting theory. I just don't want to say too much because I haven't really looked at the data closely myself to make an informed, response to that. So I can't really say.
Okay. What's so important to make the early diagnosis?
For me, it's really important because, we understand that the brain is very plastic during early development. If you have, let's say, a baby, a 1-year-old who has a stroke in the language area, and then they recover, they're going to go on and they're going to speak, and they're probably would look perfectly typical, right? Later on in life, you maybe would never know they had a stroke there. But you just have an 8-year-old who has a stroke in the same exact place, and they will probably maybe have some residual and visible language deficits. So that's just kind of one way that we know that the brain has a lot of plasticity in it and its ability to resculpt and reorganize during early life. There are a couple of research studies to show that earlier treatment leads to better outcomes than slightly later treatment for children with autism. So really for me, it's really all about just trying to have children reach their full potential. Let's try to just find out as early as we can so that children can get the support that they need, even if it's just making sure that the parents are aware, so that the parents can, there's a lot of home programming like pivotal response training and these other naturalistic therapies where you can try to stimulate a lot of development in language and social behavior by using naturalistic teaching moments in the bath or at the grocery store or at the dinner table, right? So it's just all these little moments combined that could possibly make a difference. And for families who are fortunate enough to have insurance or funds available, getting even further support from therapists and treatment agencies at a young age can have a, potentially considerable impact on the child's trajectory. So we just want to help everybody be empowered so that the kids with autism, when they grow up, they can get the jobs that they want. They can do what they want. They don't have to be limited by, challenges with being able to communicate, which is what causes a barrier for a lot of kids. Even though their IQ might be 150, they have a lot of social issues. They don't communicate particularly well, and so then they're not successful in their jobs. And so I think if we can kind of help early on and get them down a really positive path, then maybe we'll have a higher percentage of our kids going off and being able to do what they want to do without barriers.
Yes, thank you a lot.
Yeah, okay, thank you.